Hey everybody, just as a reminder, the 100 subscriber giveaway is still going on. I still do have the Rocket Cone Pro gaming mouse that I will give away once my channel hits 100 subscribers. Do not think I have forgotten about that. Now, it has been a little bit, and this video was actually unscheduled, but I had somebody make a comment on my plans for July vlog asking about the Alpha R2. And I thought that that would be actually a pretty good thing to talk about after I've owned and used it for about a year. So if you're not aware, I bought an Alienware Alpha R2 miniature gaming PC about a year ago, and I did some upgrades to it, including upgrading the RAM, repasting the CPU and GPU dies, which aren't really upgrades, but just regular service, replacing the CMOS battery, and adding storage. The computer is pretty compact and is somewhat modifiable. The computer uses an i7-6700T, which is a 35-watt, 4-core, 8-thread Intel processor. Has a GTX 970 that is mounted onto the board that it has, and has one RAM slot, an M.2 slot, and space for a SATA 2.5-inch drive. I personally put a SSD in there. Now, personally, I used it for 720p gaming because that was the resolution the monitor I had hooked up to it was, and I also did some video editing, just some real basic stuff, and it did just fine at that. I did this through the summer up until about early December, and at that time I decided to store it, but it came back out of storage again in January for Stepmania, and I used it to stream Stepmania to Twitch. I'd have the game broadcast on the machine, and then I'd also have a webcam showing me playing the game. And that game isn't very resource intensive, so it did okay at that too. After that, I brought it in, and I'm using it sort of as like a backup PC for when I don't want to have to move stuff around inside of my little room here, where I don't want to fire up my big computer, especially because of how hot it gets during this time of year. It can get up to 92, 95 inside of the house, and it's just really awful feeling. So that's one of the reasons why I don't do many like in-person videos. I do a lot of replays and things like that during the summer, and then as it cools down, I start doing these videos again. But I'm getting away from the point. The question was, how did the machine handle after long-term use? Did I have any opinions on it? Did anything change? And I thought this would actually be a really good video because apparently the user said that they are starting to see these sort of flood the secondhand market now, and they were thinking about getting one. So I thought I could come back and touch on this machine and tell them how I feel about the machine now. Now, there's been some slight modifications to the computer since I've used it. Mainly just I did a drive storage exchange. I originally had a 500 gigabyte MX500 SSD in there. I switched it out for an Inland 240 gigabyte SSD. It's Micro Center's brand, and it did just fine. Slight reduction in size, but that's it. I did make up for that by installing an external hard drive. I had a Western Digital Black 500 gigabyte hard drive, and that got put into an enclosure, and that is now my like backup space. Now, I have done benchmarking on this computer when I first had it, though it was at 720p because that was the resolution of the monitor. This time I decided to do 1080p because I have it hooked up to a 4K TV, but I mainly switch between 720p and 1080p. And I figured since we already seen some 720p gaming figures, let's A, move up to a higher resolution, and B, do some more modern games. So I have 3 games that will have benchmarked in here. Now, they're not going to be super technical because I couldn't get the 1% and 0.1% low figures to show up in Riva Tuner, but it'll still give you an idea. I have gameplay recording footage of how the game's handled. But I do have some other benchmark comparisons as well. I'm not really going to compare it to anything other than my MSI laptop, and it's going to be very quick references. I'm not really going to be focusing on, is the Alienware better than the MSI laptop? The MSI laptop is probably going to be the clear winner because it's got a 6-core, 12-thread CPU in there, and it's much newer than the Alpha R2, so I don't think it would be fair. So one of the first things we'll do is we'll look at the processor in terms of its performance. Now, I don't have a lot of tools that I can use to benchmark processors. I personally use Silverbench, which renders a photo or an image using the CPU only. It's not the best thing to use, but it is something, so it at least gives us some sort of figure. So using just the standard performance mode where it just does a simple render, the R2 managed 12501. That was its score. Now in comparison, if we were to look at the MSI laptops, it was able to do that same image at 21805. So not quite, but almost twice as powerful of a CPU inside that laptop. And I'm going to touch on this later, but I do think this CPU is probably the weak point when it comes to the whole system. Now, I decided to move into doing a graphics benchmark. Now, originally I was just going to do the Unigine Valley benchmark. It's around the same time as when the processor was created. So, like, I feel like it'd have the best representation and best results when it came to how it could handle it. And this is also when I found out I could do a couple other tweaks to the computer, and I started looking at MSI Afterburner, and I started adjusting the graphics card's performance, and I looked at being able to overclock or underclock the GPU. Now, when it came to doing overclocks and underclocks, there was only one underclock I could do, and that was just the GPU chipset itself. So I did a full underclock, -90, which was the most that MSI Afterburner would let me. And then overclocking, I ended up going plus 105 or 110 on both the memory and the GPU. What's really interesting is, like, temperature-wise, this didn't do a whole lot, and I'm wondering if it's because this computer isn't handled like a normal computer, where it sees these figures and adjusts. I think it looks at the total power limit and then just operates at the total power limit, because even with a -90 megahertz underclock on the GPU, I was still hitting similar temperatures as I would if I was doing the overclock. So I was hoping that maybe the cooling would be affected in a positive way if I underclocked it, but it didn't. And if we take a look at the R2's overclock, underclock, and stock settings, I did this in 720p. So stock, it was a 103 frames per second average. Its minimum was 33 and its max was 178. Now, if we underclocked it, that only brought it down to 100 frames per second average, and it only dropped down to 33 frames at minimum and 174 at maximum. Overclocking is kind of the same story. Overclocking, it ended up going to 108 and 34. So 108 was the average, 34 was the minimum, and then the maximum was 184. Needless to say, I decided to stay with the overclock, and then I moved into 1080p. 1080p was able to give a almost 60 frames per second average at 59.7, and it was pretty consistent. This was at high settings with 2x AA enabled. The minimum was 27 frames per second and the maximum was 115. So it's slightly lower than its 720p counterpart. So I moved on to my 3 games. I decided to do World of Tanks, the PC version, Grand Theft Auto 5, and Red Dead Redemption 2. Starting with World of Tanks, I'll show you the video footage of all of this. But starting with World of Tanks, I decided to do World of Tanks at 1080p ultra settings. So ultra everything with AA, everything was on. And at first it didn't look too bad. It was looking at like 60 frames per second, sometimes high 80s. This was before any real action started. Unfortunately, once the tanks started moving, the frames started dipping, and you can even see the frame graph. It's kind of bouncing around a little bit, not terribly, but it goes from like the teens up into the mid-20s. And yeah, once the tanks started moving, they started dropping down to like in the 40s. I got down into the 30s at some points. So I was a little let down. And if you look at the GPU and CPU, the CPU is not working that hard either, so I was really confused as to why this was happening. But it still averaged about 60 frames per second, so it was playable, but personally I'd probably turn off like anti-aliasing, maybe even drop the texture resolution down and make it a little less strenuous on the system. So then I moved on to GTA 5. Now, knowing what I saw with World of Tanks, I decided to tweak the settings on GTA 5 a little bit. I did move it down basically to all high on all the settings, and the results were as follows. GTA was also sort of all over the place. It was in the 60s for some shots, but then like here when you're flying the jet in the benchmark, I was getting from anywhere from like 48 to 61. So it was kind of bouncing around. It felt a little stuttery, and again, the CPU and GPU aren't really working all that hard. The 960, while a dated card, was still able to display this stuff at 1080p. So I'm starting to wonder if the RAM speed, which I haven't touched on, and the CPU just being a 35 watt CPU, not having the most up-to-date sort of features like a big cache and things like that, might be affecting this game. And as we go down into the city here, you can see it's even dropping down to as low as 38, 39 frames per second. So I was a little disappointed with how I was getting performance-wise off of GTA 5. I mean, I can't be too hard on it, I guess. This is a very small system. It's essentially like a laptop put inside of a box and then used as a desktop computer. But still, I was hoping for maybe in the 70s or 80s frames per second for GTA 5, and it just didn't hit it. But after seeing those results, I decided to go to Red Dead Redemption 2, and with Red Dead Redemption 2, I actually moved the performance slider down to the favors performance settings, but I used the very last favors performance settings before it goes to balanced. So it's the highest setting for favors performance, and I was hoping that maybe I would get some better results with Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead Redemption 2's results were middling. The frames per second in scenes like Valentine were in the 30s, and the CPU and the GPU were really pushing as hard as they could here at 1080p. The scene with Arthur after he does his little robbery inside of the store, same thing, it was in the 30s. And I was really starting to think maybe 1080p for these newer modern titles aren't the way to go. So I did decide to try running the game at 720p. 720p was a little bit better. Things felt a little bit smoother, at least, and the frames were a little bit higher. They were in the 40s for the Valentine and the Arthur scene following it, which was a lot more consistent and smooth. It didn't feel as stuttery as the other game did. And same thing, the CPU was working a lot harder than the GPU, so I'm starting to see this trend where I don't think the CPU is just able to keep up with the GPU. The CPU is actually a little underpowered, and that's because it's a 35 watt CPU. And I can actually show the averages that Red Dead ended up giving. So for the 1080p, the average was about 33, with minimums at 15 and the maximum at 43. But when ran in 720p, the average was 11 frames per second higher at 44, with the maximum frames being 58 and the minimum being 18. So there was definitely a noticeable improvement going from 1080p to 720p. So in terms of gaming, personally, I think that the 1080p ability of the Alpha R2 may start to be coming to an end unless you start making some adjustments and some compromises in the settings. Clearly, I overshot what I thought the Alpha R2 would be able to handle. And even with that same preset in 720p, it was only an 11 frames per second gain. So maybe I needed to look at even lower settings than what I was putting them at, which was mainly high or medium when it came to Red Dead 2, or some low, because that was all preset. So the results may seem a little disappointing, but this is still a rather dated system still. The 6700 Ti being a mobile or low power processor, 35 watts, and also being a 6th generation, which is now 6 generations old, as we are already up to the 12 series Intel processors. And the GTX 960 I don't think was as big of a problem as I thought it was going to be. My wife runs a 980 Ti in her system, and that 980 Ti handles 1080p gaming no problem. The 960 being a mid-range, it does only have 4 gigabytes of VRAM, but it seems to do okay. It seems like the processor was struggling more than the GPU. And then paired with 16 gigabytes of RAM, though it's only one stick and it's at 2133 megahertz DDR4, I think those are probably the biggest weak points for this computer. It's the processor and the RAM speed just aren't up to snuff when it comes to some of the more modern games. So if you were to play more modern games on this system and you wanted to do 1080p, I definitely look at lowering a lot of the settings or gaming in 720p even, and you might be able to get some better performance out of the computer. When it comes to doing video editing and web browsing and YouTube and stuff like that, the Alpha R2 has no problems with that. I mean, I do that stuff on a dual-core Ryzen, and it's had no issues. So this is a quad-core 8-thread. It's not going to have any problems doing sort of like general day-to-day stuff. But these games, I think, are starting to push that little 35-watt CPU to its limit. So my closing thoughts on the Alpha R2 are, I wouldn't be running out and buying one of these right now, even while they're flooding the secondary market, because I think they have a finite life left when it comes to using them for AAA gaming. If you're going to do older games or things like World of Tanks Blitz, which is a much less resource-intensive game, or Stepmania, arcade emulation, I think it would be okay for that. But Red Dead Redemption 2, GTA 5, if you're going to play those games, I definitely recommend 720p for them. But if you're going to use it as an office computer or something like that, or just a regular desktop or a home theater PC, it would be just fine at that, outside of the noise that you'll get from the fans. This setting, which isn't too bad. And then there's this setting. Blower fans have two settings, which are quiet and then like jet engines. So that is another thing to take into consideration when it comes to using this as like a home theater PC. Once it gets pretty warm, it'll get pretty loud. And this thing got up to, I believe, 89 degrees Celsius when it came to its GPU temperatures, and it was in the mid-70s on the CPU under its most intensive workloads. But yeah, that is the Alpha R2 and what I think of it today. The short version of this would be, I wouldn't go out and buy one of these unless you can get them for a very good price and you're going to be using them for very specific reasons. If you're going to try and game, I wouldn't be looking at playing AAA titles and things like that on it, because they're not going to be able to handle as well as even my MSI laptop is. My MSI laptop has an i5 inside of it, 6-core 12-thread, 45-watt, and it uses a GTX 1650, and I actually get better performance out of that laptop than I do my Alpha R2. So that's a mid-range, a solid mid-range laptop, outperforming what would have been a flagship computer system at the time. So just something to keep in mind. If you can get them, let's say if you can get them for under, I'd say like $250, maybe it's worth it. But like, I paid $400 for mine, and I don't think I'd pay $400 for it again. It's probably overvalued when it came to how much I paid for it. But that's just my personal opinion. And like I said, this is just my use and experience with the Alpha R2 over this past year since I have purchased it. Anyways, I hope this video was informative. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you were looking at an Alpha R2, this update video hopefully kind of steers you in the direction of what you want to do when it comes to possibly purchasing one or just using one in the future. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video. Take it easy. Bye-bye.